There is no peace process. There has been no peace process now since basically the year 2000, with the failure of the Camp David peace talks, followed by the start of the Second Intifada, and eventually the reoccupation of the West Bank by the Israeli army. There have been various initiatives, conferences, the Annapolis Conference in 2007, for instance, the Berlin Conference a year later. These were just show. They brought nothing new to the table, no new political commitment or political momentum, and there was no real learning of lessons, no fundamental evaluation or re-evaluation of the approach. So all the problems that had led to the collapse of the peace process in the first place were not being addressed, they weren't being acknowledged. And therefore, in a sense, every new statement recommitting the international community, the European Union, the United States, the UN, to the peace process or to the two-state solution in Palestine and Israel was pure cosmetic. That's the sort of the real truth of it. This is a very interesting question because, first of all, the Trump administration didn't really have a clear policy at the beginning and has only evolved something that cannot be called a policy really, but is more a collection of different ideas, initiatives, responses over time that are driven by different characters within the Trump administration. So now that John Bolton is on board, for instance, he takes probably the most extreme hawkish position in total favor of Israel, in total hostility to the Palestinians, and I don't mean simply opposition, but actual hostility. People like Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of the president, the US ambassador in Israel, who's a total, someone who's committed totally to the idea of Greater Israel, of colonization and annexation of the occupied territories, etc. So as these people have come on board and become actors, in that sense they've started to create a policy for the Trump administration or the White House to follow. So I think it's important to remember that the Trump administration has never had a real policy and now has what looks like a policy but could change yet again. I don't mean to be optimistic about the prospects. I think these changes are going to be long-lasting, and even if the Trump administration leaves, it's not clear that the next US administration, even if it is totally different, will see any real reason to provoke Israeli reactions in order to shift US policy back to a more even-handed approach, let alone restart a meaningful peace process. All of that would take far too much political capital, and therefore, even if the next US administration is not so hostile to the Palestinians, is willing to recommit, at least verbally, to a two-state solution, I don't think they're really going to make a major effort. The Arab states won't force them to anymore. The Saudi Arabian government is clearly more committed to other foreign policy objectives. Egypt and others, despite their concerns, won't prioritize this issue, and therefore the United States won't prioritize it either. So if I were to, sort of leave the question with one main answer, I mean, from a historical perspective, what the Trump administration has done is to go back not only to 1975, when the US administration, especially in the figure of then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, promised the Israeli government, then headed by Yitzhak Rabin, that the US would never talk to the PLO unless the PLO recognized Israel. Well, now we have a situation where the PLO has recognized Israel, where the Palestinian Authority, under the PLO leader, Mahmoud Abbas, daily provides security coordination and security protection for Israel in the occupied territories, and yet the US administration now, in effect, does not talk to the PLO and has just told it to close its delegation in Washington. So the Trump administration has taken us back in time by 43 years, and in fact has taken us back all the way to the 1950s, when the US policy on Palestine after 1948, when Israel was established, when most of Palestine was taken over to become Israel, when 2/3 of all the Palestinians were made refugees, the US policy then was not to treat the Palestine problem as a political problem or as a problem of national self-determination, but rather to treat it purely as a humanitarian problem of resettling refugees. And so the US then invested in plans to develop the Jordan River and resettle refugees in agriculture. In effect, Trump has taken us all the way back to that by trying to remove the Palestine problem entirely from the map, resolving that Jerusalem shall be a capital of Israel only, that there shall be no Palestinian refugee problem, and therefore he's taken off the key issues that were supposed to be negotiated. He's saying these shall not be negotiated anymore. This takes us back to 1948, and even less, because now he's cut off the money that was supposed to help refugees, whereas at least in the 1950s the US was willing to invest in the rehabilitation of the Palestinian refugees, and now the US is actually seeking to destroy the UN agency that in all the decades since then was taking care of the refugees, those who still after 6 or 7 decades don't have real futures, because whether they're in Gaza or in the West Bank or in Syria or in Lebanon, these millions of people are stateless. They have no state documents. They cannot emigrate freely. They can't set up businesses freely. So in a sense, the Trump administration's policy of denying their refugee status, dismantling UNRWA, the refugee agency, ignores the fact that several million of them actually live in a total legal limbo. They don't have the ability to just move on and integrate into countries that don't want to integrate them in the first place. Ironically, it's not the Israeli government that's demanding the dismantling of UNRWA or the ending of funding for the refugees, because actually Israel knows that if the Palestinians in the occupied territories under siege in Gaza lose all funding, the situation will become a complete disaster, will become critical, the risk of violence, of a humanitarian catastrophe for which Israel will be blamed, or which Israel will then have to resolve by opening up borders, by allowing movement of people to work in Israel, by allowing freer access for markets. These are things they've tried not to do, and the only reason that Israel could avoid allowing real freedom for trade and investment and labor movement and so on is because the international community, including the USA, provides the funding. But if the US cuts off the funding, major funding, without requiring Israel to provide free access for goods, trade, people, capital, money, etc., then they're basically condemning these people to meltdown, even to starvation. So Israel actually hasn't called for all this. So what the Trump administration is doing today is the result of the agenda of some of the most right-wing, some of the most nationalist, some of the most evangelical ideologues in the USA. This is a domestic US thing. It's not an Israeli demand. It's just that there are people like the US ambassador in Israel who wants things because he's a believer in Greater Israel. He believes in eliminating the Palestine conflict by basically making the Palestinians dissolve and disappear. But this is not the agenda of even the most right-wing government of Israel. So this is a US domestic thing where US policy has been hijacked by sort of the extreme right in the USA. There is no two-state solution anymore. I continue to believe and agree with most commentators, analysts, government officials in Palestine, in the West, not in the Israeli government today, but at least in some Israeli quarters, that the two-state solution is the only one we can imagine at the moment that is sort of can be sold politically to majorities on both sides, that can receive international support and funding and political support and so on. So it's the only one in that sense that appears realistic. At the same time, it isn't realistic in the sense that in today's political realities within Palestine and Israel, in the region, given the contest between Arab governments and Iran, given US policy, given the rise of right-wing nationalist populism around the globe, given all these different things, no one has the time, the capital, the attention span to focus on helping to bring a Palestinian state into being. This leaves the Palestinians hopelessly divided, hopelessly at the mercy of Israel, first and foremost, hopelessly therefore at the mercy of whoever happens to govern in Israel, whoever happens to sit in the White House. And if we look at these long-term trends, I just don't see why the European Union, faced with such grave threats to its own future from within its ranks, why the US, faced with this deep divide along people who believe in white nationalism, supremacy in the USA, the race divide, the focus of wealth on the 1% in the US, which is producing such deep division around the world. We face this. Why on earth will anyone invest the capital in helping the Palestinians, or even in helping the Israelis resolve something? Because sooner or later, this is going to be a problem that Israel will face, yet again. And I don't just mean with a war again in Gaza, but by making a two-state solution impossible, Israel becomes exclusively responsible for the fate of some 6 million Palestinians who live under its control and its rule, either in the West Bank with no citizenship rights, or in East Jerusalem, where they have some rights to access to Israel, or in Gaza, where they're basically prisoners and have been for 25 or so years, or even in Israel, where the citizens of Israel who are non-Jewish have been told that Israel is specifically a Jewish state, and therefore what exactly this means for their civil and political rights in this entity is now in question. So Israel has made itself responsible for the long-term fate of 6 million human beings who have the right of human beings everywhere in every country of the world to make choices about what kinds of life they wish to live as individuals, to be painters or workers, dentists or surgeons, librarians or businessmen and women, freely, and to invest and to travel and to create. And whether they do this in a state called Israel or in a state called Palestine or something else, they have the right to this. And by controlling their access to passports, to travel, to business opportunities, to investment, to markets, Israel has made itself the one power that is completely, politically, legally, and morally responsible for their lives as individuals, let alone as a national collective. So I think that, again, the two-state solution today is not viable, not because we can't imagine it, because there is no political actor today who, outside of the Palestinians at least, who has that priority, for whom that is the one most important thing. I guess today, only the Palestinians, who have certainly contributed to this outcome and made their own mistakes, and yet it is only they today who have an unequivocal, unquestionable interest in having a two-state solution. But right now, they're the only people who are as clearly in need of it and as unequivocally clearly committed to it.